So lately a lot of people have been like,
where's the X99 overclocking tutorial?
and so it's finally here. So it's finally time to overclock the 5820k. Now a lot of you guys have been asking for a long time, like, where's the X99 5820k overclocking tutorial? And I've been meaning to do it. It's just that I haven't got around to it, mainly due to the Gigabyte UD4 BIOS. Before the recent F9 BIOS update, which I recommend everyone do if you're on a Gigabyte motherboard, was just crashing at random. And so I didn't want to do a tutorial if my computer was just crashing at random. It really was at random, even on fully stable overclocks. Before that, I also had the X99 MSI motherboard, which just blew out on me. So yeah, that crapped out on me. I returned that. But without further ado, let's talk about the characteristics of this CPU, because it is a little bit different to its little brother, the standard Haswell 4-core. And it mainly differs in the diminishing returns and that sweet spot level. Basically for the 5820K, I found, maybe my CPU, and I'll talk about this throughout the tutorial, maybe my CPU was just not that good and I lost the silicon lottery. But the diminishing returns seriously kicked in hard after 4 gigs on this CPU, as opposed to my Haswell 4-core, which kicked in at about 4.4 gigs. Even though I could get this CPU to 4.6 gigs without using too much wattage. It only went up to 260 watts from the wall at 4.6 gigs. And that 260 watts is pretty much the exact same as this CPU at stock voltages and stock CPU speeds. So that's a real eye-opener, isn't it? Like, this thing just burns through power, Haswell-E. So with that being said, I managed to get this to 4 gigs at 1.11 volt, and at those speeds and those voltages, it burned up about 310 watts from the wall. And now an interesting thing to note, that's about a 600 megahertz overclock over the 3.4 gigs on all cores turbo base clock. And another thing to remember is that when I overclocked it to 4.2 gigs, it needed an extra 90 millivolts. This is fully stable, rendering a video, etc., not just booting into Windows and doing a benchmark. To get this thing fully stable, I had to give it an additional 90 millivolts, which is pretty huge. So you can see there on my CPU, the diminishing returns kicked in hard after about 4 gigs. And so today I'm going to be recommending a 4 gig overclock. And I do implore you guys to go for the best sweet spot overclock you can. Just keep in mind the voltages. And on Haswell and Haswell-E, the voltages are pretty much directly correlated to the power consumption. And so this thing at 4.2 gigs, it used up about 360 watts from the wall. So we can see there an extra 50 watts for 200 megahertz is clearly not worth it. But an extra 50 watts for 600 megahertz, that kind of is worth it, right? So anyway, without further ado, let's move on now to the overclocking tutorial and let's get it on. Okay, so let's get on with the overclocking tutorial. Now, the first thing you'll need is, as you can see, I'm on the desktop here. The first thing you'll need is, and pretty much the only thing you'll need to do this overclock, is a program called i7-5820k. Now, I'll put the link in the description below. You can download it. It is a pay-to-use program. However, it does come with a 30-day free trial. And honestly, in my opinion, that's all you're going to need is 30 days to fine-tune your overclock. So once you've downloaded that, we can then open it, and we'll just get familiar with it before we start actually overclocking it. So this is i7-5820k. Generally, I usually do recommend Prime 95 and Real Temp. However, I found with the Haswell-E 6-core, especially since they've got hyper-threading, I find Prime 95 does over-exaggerate the temps and also over-exaggerates the power usage on the Haswell-E's. On the 4-core Haswells, however, it did an absolutely fine job of giving me max temps and max power consumption. However, as I said before, on the Haswell-E, I do find that it over-exaggerates both the power consumption and the heat. So I'm finding on the Haswell-E, i7-5820k gets it pretty right. So it's a pretty good program for overclocking Haswell-E. Anyway, once we're in the program, we can go to Tools, click on Tools here and go to CPU ID. And that'll essentially tell us what overclock we're getting, if the Intel sort of speed step technology is working as well. That's when it scales down your CPU when it's not in usage. And also we can then open up system stability test. Now before you start overclocking, as with all my overclocking tutorials, I do recommend that you run your computer in for a few days at best, just to make sure none of your hardware is faulty, because if you start overclocking and your system's crashing right from as soon as you get your system, It could be because you haven't actually have a faulty part. For instance, faulty RAM. That'll cause your computer to randomly crash, randomly restart, etc. So I do recommend, if you do get Haswell-E, I recommend running it in for a few days on auto just to make sure everything is fine, and then we can begin overclocking it. However, I'll just show you. We click start here. We want to stress the CPU, we want to stress the CPU, FPU, system case, and stress the system memory as well. That'll give us a good idea of how much power we're going to use if we're, for instance, rendering a video in real time and whatnot. So I find these four on the default check settings is the best for stress testing your CPU. Now, one thing you will notice here is it's 100%, and also I do recommend making sure this line is always at 100% when you're stress testing with i7-64. If it's not always at 100%, then in my opinion, that's not a stable overclock. When I first started overclocking my Haswell-E CPU at 4 gigs, I was trying to fine tune this 4 gig overclock. I was finding that it was dropping occasionally at lower voltages, and this in turn led to spiking and stuttering in games. So you want to make sure this line, if you do achieve any sort of overclock on Haswell-E, you do want to make sure that this line here is running at 100% at all times. As we can see here, it's running at 3.54 gigs on all cores. And it's 100% stable. It's getting up to about 43 degrees. The ambient temps in here are about 16 degrees. So in the summer, it will be a bit hotter. I'd say it'd go up to around about 60 something degrees in the summer. As for the cooler, I'm using an Animax T40, which is a $40 cooler. I do recommend it for the 6 cores. It does an absolute fine job of getting that stable sweet spot overclock on this CPU. And as I said before, we'll be going for a 4 gig overclock today. So let's get on with it. We can hit stop, we can close that down, hit the reset button here. So restart our computer. And sorry about my desktop, I know there's icons everywhere all over the place, but as we're restarting it, we can hit the delete key to enter BIOS. Now, one thing about this BIOS is it is the Gigabyte UD4 BIOS for the X99 motherboard. If you have an ASUS motherboard, an MSI motherboard, or an EVGA motherboard, your BIOS will most likely look different. However, a lot of the settings should be similar, especially when we switch to classic mode. So they don't mind the settings here, just try to find the settings if you're using a different BIOS. If you're using the exact same BIOS, then that's great. You can pretty much just copy everything I'm doing today. However, if you're on a different BIOS, just try to look for the same settings. And if you're confused, put a comment in the comment section below and I'll help you out there as well. Now that we're in the BIOS, so we've hit delete, we've entered the BIOS, we can then hit F2. And essentially this will take us to the classic look. So if you're in the Gigabyte BIOS, you hit F2 until you get to this classic looking BIOS. Now, once we're in here, so today we'll just be overclocking the CPU core. We're not going to bother with memory today. I will make a DDR4 memory overclock tutorial and I'll put the link in the description below for that as well. But today we'll just be focusing on the CPU itself and going for a 4 gig, and in my case, in my CPU, a sweet spot for my CPU. So you guys are welcome to copy these settings. And if you do copy these settings, I pretty much guarantee anyone on a Haswell-E 5820k will be able to copy my settings and have a stable overclock. Anyway, with that being said, let's go to MIT up the top here. So that's the MIT tab. Make sure your num lock is on so you can use the numpad. And also we'll go down, so we're using the keyboard in BIOS. And we go down here to advanced frequency settings. So that's the one I want you to hit. Hit enter, and we want to go in here. And CPU base clock, I like to actually set this at 100 megahertz exactly. So make sure the CPU is not playing any funny buggers. If you want to hit it a bit higher, that's up to you. If you want to leave it on auto, you can. I just like to hit it in at 100 manually. As for CPU upgrade, we don't want to touch that. I just don't touch that in general because I know what I'm doing manually. So with the CPU clock ratio, we want to hit in 40 on the numpad and then press enter. And that will essentially take our CPU all the way up to 4 gigs. Now your CPU, chances are you'll probably have a better CPU than me that might be able to go to 4.2 gigs at 1.1 volt. 1.11 volt, it's up to you. But as a baseline, we're going to go with 4 gigs today. So you hit in 40 and you press enter, and that'll take it up to 4 gigs. We can then go into advanced CPU core settings, and this is pretty important. We then hit enter, And K overclock, we don't want to touch this. CPU PLL selection, you can put this on Southbridge if you want to. If you're finding you're having a hard time and you've tried everything else, then you can put this on Southbridge PLL. But for what it's worth on Haswell-E, I find leaving it on auto was fine. However, on my actual MSI Z87 motherboard with the 4-core, I found having this on Southbridge actually helped out a lot. So it's up to you guys. You can leave it on auto. You don't have to worry about that. Filter PLL level, you can leave that on auto as well. That's not going to make too much of a difference, especially since we're going for a nice and easy overclock of 4 gigs. Uncore ratio, now this is an interesting thing, and I have to talk about this a little bit because I believe my CPU has the worst uncore in the world, or the worst cache clock in the world. I can only get this up to 3.6 gig max, and that's with like 1.2 volt. So you can see that my cache rate or uncore ratio is really bad. So I actually have to set it at 3.3 gigs at 1.06 volts. So you're welcome to copy my cache ratio. However, in a perfect world, this should be at 39. That would be the sweet spot with a 4 gig overclock. Having it 100 megahertz lower than your CPU clock ratio is the best. The second best thing is to have it a little bit lower. So in my case, 3.3 gig is absolutely fine. So we set that. You guys can copy it, just put it at 33 if you want to. If you can go higher, then you can test that in your own time. But we can go down here to C state support. I like to disable that. All the other functions, you can leave them on, as they will be saving you a little bit of power when your computer is not using its full load. Anyway, we can hit escape. Once we've done those settings, we can hit escape again. And now we can go down to advanced voltage settings. And so in here, we want to hit enter, and then we want to go to CPU core voltage control. And now once we hit enter again, we'll see here we've got a few different settings. CPU VRIN, I like to manually set this to 1.8 volt. Now if you're going for a higher overclock, say 4.4 gig, 4.5 gig, you may wish to set this to 1.9 volt. My MSI motherboard X99 that blew out, that had this on 1.9 volt by default. So it's up to you guys. I personally like to leave it at 1.8, the default setting. If you want to go higher, you can, but I like to dial in 1.8 volts. So you can copy my setting, you should be fine. Now for CPU vCore, this is the most important setting, especially when we're going for a 4 gig overclock on the CPU itself. You're welcome to copy my setting here. I go for 1.11 volt, and so that's my sweet spot at 4 gigs. If you've got a better CPU, you might be even able to drop this down to say 1.7 volt, 1.8 volt. So you can test that in your own time, but if you don't care and you're just like me and you want to quickly get a quick overclock, if you don't care about if you've won the silicon lottery or not, and you just want to copy my settings, then feel free to. For instance, if I dropped it down to 1.9 volt, I could probably boot into Windows, but as I showed you before, that line was not at 100% stable. It actually has some little drops in it. So that indicates that the overclock is not stable. So I actually had to give it a little bit more voltage, and then I do like to give it an extra 5 millivolts on top of that just for safety. So there, you can copy my setting of 1.11 volt, and I'm pretty sure you'll be fine. Now, CPU ring ratio. I actually had to give my CPU 1.06 volt. I actually had to give it more voltage than the default setting to actually get this stable, which really surprised me because the auto is 1.05 volt. And as I said to you guys before, I believe I have one of the worst cache ratios in the world. So I had to give this 1.06 volt. For what it's worth, you should be able to leave this at 1.05 volt and it should be absolutely fine. So now once we've done that, we can hit escape. So these other voltages here as well, you don't want to touch them unless you're going for pretty high overclocks or you're going for high overclocks on your memory, especially the system agent voltage. So anyway, we can hit back here, escape. We can hit escape again, and we can go over to BIOS features quickly and make sure that our boot drive is the one in the picture here. So my Intel SSD is the main boot drive. That is confirmed. Make sure your hard drive is your first boot priority. That'll probably save a little bit of time in the BIOS boot. Also the full screen logo, I like to set that to disable. It's just an old school thing. You can copy that if you want to. Once you've finished with all your overclocks, you can also enable fast boot. That's up to you. I like to leave it off just to let my BIOS go through the rounds. That being done, peripherals here, we can go to initial display output and make sure that's set to your graphics card. And then audio LED, I like to leave it in still mode. I don't like all the fancy lights going off. The rear panel LED, I like to turn that off, as I don't really look at the rear panel of my computer much. And once we're done there, we can hit, we can go down to Save Profiles. And we can hit, sorry about that break, I just had to cough. Anyway, once we've done that, we can go to Save Profiles, hit the profile, and we can type in whatever profile you want to call this. I'll call this 4 gig stable, and I'll hit OK. As you can see there, the mouse doesn't really work that well in BIOS. So hit the keyboard, hit OK, and the profile is now saved. We can go to Save and Exit, and hit Enter, and Save Configuration Reset, yes. So once we've done that, our computer should now reboot. And sorry, it's really dry in this room at the moment, so I may have to give some more cough breaks as well. So anyway, if your computer fails to boot, especially on these settings, I would maybe, two things are either happening. You need to update your BIOS, especially in my case, the Gigabyte BIOS. I had to update it to the latest BIOS in order to get 100% stable boots every time. You may also have the worst CPU in the world. I don't imagine that happening, but you may have to give your CPU a little bit more voltage if you can't, especially if you can't boot into Windows. I'm pretty sure everyone should be able to boot into Windows at 4 gigs at 1.11 volt. So once we've done that, as we can see here, my desktop is really messy, but that's because I'm really busy at the moment. I've got to make a lot of videos, I've got to do a lot of stuff for IRL, for work as well. But once we're in the desktop here, we can open up IDA64, double click that, open it up, and we should be entering IDA64. And again, we just open up Tools, CPU ID, and then we go to System Stability Test as well. Make sure all these 4 boxes are checked. We don't have to stress local disks, and we don't have to stress local GPUs. So once we've got that ready, we can hit Start, and we can see here 4 gigs, it's confirmed. It's a multiplier of 40 there. It's 100%, and we can see the temperatures are really not that, well, they should, you got to give this a good minute to let your temperatures seep in, but we can see the temperatures will probably max out around 50 degrees. We can see 100%, that should just be a solid line that does not dip at all. If this is dipping a little bit, and if you're giving it a lot more voltage, for instance, if it's dipping at 1.11 volt, and then you go up to 1.15 volt and it's still dipping, then it may be your CPU cache ratio. You might have to give that a bit more voltage, or you may have some really bad bloatware on your system. So if you have bad bloatware on your system, that's something you may wish to get checked out. But for what it's worth, this is what your graph should look like if you have a stable overclock. Now, another thing about a stable overclock is that, let me explain here, is that you will want to test this with rendering, CPU intensive games. I find like Arma 3 is a pretty good game for benchmarking and finding a solid CPU overclock as well, because the games pretty much put a dynamic load on the CPU, and that they're always changing how much they load on the CPU. So CPU intensive games are great for stress testing a CPU, especially a stable overclock. Also rendering videos. I find that Premiere Pro, when I was rendering a video, that would really see if I had a stable overclock. For instance, I had my CPU at 1.18 volt at 4.2 gigs. However, it would still crash in Premiere Pro when I was rendering a video, even though it passed IDA64. So with that being said, you will want to make sure, and I had to up it to 1.2 volt to actually let it render this whole 10-minute video. So even though it's stable in IDA64, that doesn't mean it's stable in everything. So just keep that in mind. So yeah, you want to render some videos, and once you've tried, this 100% line, when it's pretty much not dipping at all, that'll be a general indicator that you're really close to a stable overclock, if not already stable. So pretty much, yeah, as you can see here, this is my sweet spot overclock. As I said in the intro, before, this was pretty much the sweet spot. If I went up to 4.2 gig at 1.2 volt, it would just use up an extra 50 watt, put more stress on my motherboards, power supply, etc. And in my opinion, it just wasn't worth it. And so, yeah, you guys may have, of course, you will have a different CPU. you will have to put it through the stress. Maybe you might be able to get 4.2 gig at 1.14 volt, for example. And so if your CPU has a better sweet spot than mine, then I recommend that you find it. See, if I got a good CPU, I could have been doing a different tutorial today where I recommend a 4.2 gig overclock. So I'm actually glad that I got kind of one of the worst CPUs if I'm doing a tutorial for you guys, because you kind of know that this is a worst case scenario when overclocking. So I'm glad I could show you this. And this is, yeah, my sweet spot for my CPU. I will be running it at 4 gigs, even though my 4670K runs at 4.6 gigs at 1.26 volt. And it only burns up less power. The funny thing about my 4 core, is that it burns up less power from the wall at 4.6 gig than this CPU does at default voltage and stock clocks. So that's something interesting about the 4 core. It's actually, I really enjoy the 4 core. I actually enjoy it more than the Haswell-E, even though the Haswell-E is an absolute beast when it comes to those productivity orientated tasks like rendering a video. It just chows through that. So anything when it comes to using the threads, the Haswell-E is definitely a good CPU. Anyway guys, that about wraps it up for the CPU overclocking tutorial. I wanted to keep this as simple as possible, and since my CPU, as I explained before, isn't the best, I'm pretty sure everyone will be able to copy these settings and they should be fine. Now I do implore you guys to try and find your sweet spot overclock. Again, I said that might be around 4.2 gig to 4.4. It may even be 4 just like I've got today, but I'm guessing it's somewhere between 4 to 4.2. as opposed to Haswell, the original 4 core, which in my opinion was around about 4.2 to 4.4. So I'd say there'd be about a 200 megahertz leeway, just because the die is bigger, there's a little bit more leakage than the 4 core has. So anyways, if you have any questions or comments about this video, please leave a comment in the comments section below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Or someone else will help you if I can't. There's a lot of helpful people around here. And if you enjoyed, or if you don't understand anything at all, and you're like, Brian, please tell me, what does this mean? Then I'll help you out in the comment section below. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you have any questions, yeah, again, put a comment in the comment section below. If you haven't already, subscribe to Tech City. I'll keep some more tech videos coming for you guys. I'll also be doing the DDR4 tutorial very soon, and then I'll be uploading it most likely tomorrow, so you guys can check that out. There's a few differences between DDR4 as opposed to the CPU. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and peace out for now. Bye.